Welcome back to US Geopolitics Insight. I want to begin tonight with a geometry lesson, not the kind taught in classrooms, the kind that determines whether a naval force lives or dies in a confined maritime theater when the adversary has studied its defensive geometry for 20 years and has finally acquired the weapons system specifically optimized to exploit every gap in it. The Persian Gulf is not an ocean. It is a body of water approximately 990 km long and at its widest point 34 km across at the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point through which the entire Gulf's maritime traffic must pass. That is the geographic reality within which the United States Navy has been projecting power for 30 years, on the assumption that its defensive architecture was sufficient to dominate any threat environment that adversary could generate within those dimensions. Last night Iran demonstrated what happens when an adversary acquires a weapon system whose operational geometry was specifically designed for exactly this kind of confined maritime kill zone, and deploys it in the numbers required to saturate every defensive layer simultaneously. 600 YJ-12E supersonic anti-8-ship cruise missiles. Chinese design, Chinese manufactured, transferred to Iran through a logistics channel that Western intelligence had been monitoring with insufficient urgency for 14 months. Launched from a combination of Iranian coastal batteries, surface vessels, and fixed-wing aircraft operating from 4 air bases across southern Iran in a coordinated multi-axis attack that compressed the engagement timeline for American defensive systems to a window that Aegis combat planning had never modeled as a realistic threat scenario. The USS Gerald R. Ford gone, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower gone, the USS Theodore Roosevelt gone, 3 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, the physical embodiment of American power projection doctrine, the platforms around which the United States has organized its entire approach to Middle Eastern security for half a century. All 3 struck, all 3 burning, all 3 in the process of sinking within a 94-minute operational window that began at 0318 hours local time and ended when the last surviving American surface combatant in the Persian Gulf crossed the Hormuz threshold heading south on the Fifth Fleet. The operational naval command that Washington has maintained in Bahrain since 1995 as the instrument of American Gulf dominance is gone and not repositioned, not tactically withdrawn pending reassessment. It's gone. Its surviving vessels are in the Gulf of Oman, running at maximum sustainable speed away from a threat environment that has just demonstrated with a clarity that admits no analytical ambiguity that American surface combatants cannot survive inside the Persian Gulf against the weapons system Iran deployed last night. Let me say what that means in terms that cut through the diplomatic language already being constructed in Washington to obscure it. The United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, has been permanently expelled from the Persian Gulf by a nation that Washington has spent 45 years attempting to sanction, isolate, and pressure into strategic irrelevance. The expulsion is not temporary. It is not a tactical withdrawal pending the development of countermeasures. It is permanent in the sense that matters strategically. Iran now holds the capability to repeat last night's operation against any American surface force that attempts to re-enter the Gulf at a cost to Iran. That is a fraction of the cost to the United States of the assets it would lose in the attempt. The geometry has changed. And with the geometry, everything else, 3 questions will drive tonight's complete analysis. First, how did Iran plan, acquire, and execute a 600-missile YJ-12E coordinated strike against 3 simultaneous carrier strike groups in a confined maritime theater? And why did the most sophisticated naval air defense architecture ever assembled fail to prevent the outcome it was specifically deployed to prevent? Second, what does the YJ-12E represent as a weapon system? What does its transfer from China to Iran tell us about the evolving architecture of the anti-American strategic alignment that Washington has spent years insisting does not exist as a coherent operational reality? And what does its performance last night tell us about the future of American carrier-based power projection against peer competitor weapons technology? Third, with the Fifth Fleet expelled, with 3 carriers on the Persian Gulf seafloor, with the Strait of Hormuz under Iranian fire control, and with Washington in a condition of institutional crisis that its public communications are working very hard to characterize as something less alarming than what it actually is. What does the strategic map look like this morning? And what has last night permanently changed about the distribution of power in this region and beyond? If this channel has been providing the analysis that takes seriously what others dismiss that covered the YJ-12E transfer when mainstream commentary was calling it unconfirmed, that modeled its operational implications when official voices were calling them manageable. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with every person in your network who wants to understand what is actually happening rather than the version being assembled for public consumption. Leave your assessment in the comments. I want to know what you think Washington does when every retaliatory option available requires capabilities that the retaliatory context has made temporarily unavailable, because that question does not have a settled answer in any deliberation room in Washington this morning. Now let us go inside what happened to understand what Iran executed last night. You need to understand what the YJ-12E was designed to do, not in the abstract sense of its technical specifications, but in the specific operational sense of the threat architecture it was engineered to defeat. Because the YJ-12E is not a general-purpose anti-8 ship missile, it is a weapons system whose every design parameter reflects a specific operational problem that Chinese military engineers spent 15 years solving. How do you defeat an American carrier strike group's layered air defense in a confined maritime theater where the geometry of the engagement favors the attacker? The answer they arrived at has 3 components: speed, altitude, and numbers. The YJ-12E travels at speeds between Mach 2 and Mach 3 in its terminal phase at Mach 2. The time between radar acquisition at maximum detection range and missile impact is measured in seconds. Far fewer seconds than the Aegis engagement sequence requires to generate a valid intercept solution, launch an interceptor, guide it to the engagement point, and achieve a kill. And the supersonic terminal velocity is not incidental to the YJ-12's design. It is the central design parameter around which every other characteristic was developed. The missile is fast because the speed compresses the engagement timeline to a window that American naval air defense was not optimized to operate within. The sea-skimming terminal flight profile compounds the radar detection problem in ways that the YJ-12E designers understood and exploited deliberately. A missile flying at low altitude below 50 meters above the ocean surface in its terminal approach is not detectable by surface radar arrays beyond the geometric horizon, which at those altitudes and at the surface combatant heights of American Aegis vessels is approximately 25 to 35 kilometers. A YJ-12E approaching at Mach 2.5 from 30 kilometers. And the outer boundary of reliable surface radar detection in sea-skimming profile reaches its target in approximately 43 seconds. 43 seconds from detection to impact. The SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors that form the primary engagement layer of American carrier strike group defense require launch mid-course guidance update and terminal homing sequences that, against a seconding supersonic target detected at 30 kilometers, produce intercept probabilities well below their nominal figures against higher altitude, slower moving targets. The YJ-12E was designed around those 43 seconds. Every performance parameter exists to ensure that 43 seconds is the maximum engagement timeline that American defensive systems have available. Iran understood this geometry, and Iran acquired 600 YJ-112E missiles transferred through a logistics architecture that Chinese state entities facilitated without the explicit fingerprints that would have triggered American interdiction responses to exploit it at a scale that the geometry's defensive implications become operationally decisive. The operational planning for what Iranian military designations record as Operation Closed Horizon was developed across a 19-month period following the confirmed availability of the YJ-12E inventory. The planning incorporated 3 simultaneous carrier strike groups as a target architecture that Iranian planners had assessed as a maximum American naval presence likely to be assembled in the theater and whose simultaneous engagement would eliminate American carrier aviation from the Persian Gulf in a single operational night. At 247 hours, Phase 1 commenced. 12 Iranian electronic warfare platforms, a combination of purpose-built jamming vessels operating under commercial registry and land-based jamming installations across the Makran coast and Kashum Island, activated a coordinated emissions package targeting the AN-SPY-6 air and missile defense radar arrays aboard the Gerald R. Board's Constellation-class escort vessels and the Legacy SPY-1D arrays aboard the Eisenhower and Roosevelt strike group escorts. The jamming architecture was specifically tuned to degrade detection performance in the low-altitude search modes that Aegis radars use for sea-skimming cruise missile detection. The precise capability most critical to defending against the YJ-12E's terminal flight profile detection range against sea-skimming targets normally 25 to 35 kilometers under clear electromagnetic conditions was degraded to approximately 12 to 17 kilometers under the jamming conditions. Iran, established in Phase 1 at Mach 2.512 kilometers, provides approximately 19 seconds of engagement timeline from detection to impact. 19 seconds. That is the window within which every SM-2 launch authorization, interceptor guidance, uplink, and phalanx close-in engagement across 3 simultaneous carrier strike groups needed to occur at 3 hours. Phase 2 commenced. 600 YJ-12E missiles were launched from 4 categories of platforms simultaneously. 140 were launched from Iranian Suoi Su-22 and Su-24 strike aircraft operating at low altitude from 4 air bases across Fars or Mosan and Bushehr provinces. Aircraft that had been holding at terrain masking altitudes below Iranian radar coverage to avoid American airborne early warning detection until the moment of launch. 180 were launched from truck-mounted coastal battery positions distributed across 43 separate sites along the Iranian coastline from Bandarbas to Chabahar, positions selected to maximize azimuth diversity of the inbound threat vectors, forcing the American Aegis systems to generate engagement solutions against threats arriving simultaneously from multiple compass directions. 140 were launched from Iranian fast attack craft and missile corvettes that had sortied from coastal anchorages under commercial traffic cover 48 hours earlier and were holding at pre-positioned launch points across the northern Gulf. 140 were launched from 4 Iranian frigates operating in a surface action group that had been conducting what American intelligence had assessed as a routine patrol in the Central Gulf for 11 days. The azimuth diversity of 600 simultaneous sea-skimming inbound tracks arriving from 4 categories of platform across 360 degrees of approach, bearing against 3 carrier strike groups holding position across a 90-mile arc under jamming degraded low-altitude detection conditions, produce an engagement geometry that American carrier strike group defensive doctrine had never modeled as a survivable scenario. Not because the scenario had never been conceptualized, because modeling it honestly would have required acknowledging that the scenario was possible, which would have required acknowledging that the carrier strike group as a force structure had fundamental survivability limitations against peer competitor anti-H-ship weapons deployed in sufficient numbers from sufficient azimuth diversity. That acknowledgement was institutionally unavailable. The engagement lasted 94 minutes from the first SM-6 launch to the last American surface combatant clearing the Hormuz threshold heading south of the 600 YJ-12E missiles launched. American and coalition defensive systems achieved confirmed kills against 217, a figure that evaluated against the nominal performance specifications of Aegis and Phalanx systems under unjammed conditions represents a severe underperformance, and that evaluated against the degraded detection conditions and compressed engagement timelines produced by Iranian Phase 1 jamming represents performance broadly consistent with what honest threat modeling would have predicted. 383 YJ-12E missiles reached terminal phase against American surface combatants. The Gerald R. Ford received 17 impacts, the Eisenhower 14, the Roosevelt 11, their escort vessels, the destroyers and cruisers whose Aegis systems had been the primary defensive layer and whose interceptor inventories had been exhausted in the engagement, received the remaining impacts distributed across the surviving surface combatants in the three strike groups by 3:52 hours. All three carriers were sinking by 0441 hours. The last surviving American combatant had cleared the strait. There is a conversation that Western governments have been refusing to have honestly for 3 years. It concerns the operational reality of what Chinese strategists call in internal military documents that Western intelligence has had access to for longer than official policy has acknowledged the anti-Monic U alignment, the informal, deniable, strategically coherent coordination between states whose primary shared interest is the erosion of American military primacy across every theater where that primacy currently operates as a constraint on their respective strategic objectives. The YJ-12E transfer to Iran is the most operationally significant manifestation of that alignment that has yet occurred. And it is worth examining precisely because the Western framing of it as a commercial transaction, as a proliferation concern to be managed through export control mechanisms, as something other than what it actually is, has directly contributed to the strategic outcome of last night. The YJ-12E is not a system that China exports to general customers. It is a frontline People's Liberation Army Navy anti-H ship platform whose performance specifications, Mach 2 TO3 terminal velocity seaming profile, active radar terminal homing electronic countermeasures package, place it in the category of weapons that Chinese export policy has historically restricted to preserve the capability advantage over potential adversaries that makes it operationally valuable. Transferring it to Iran was a strategic decision, not a commercial one. It was a decision made with full understanding of what Iran would do with it and full understanding of what the operational consequences would be for American naval presence in the Persian Gulf. I am not asserting that Beijing authorized or directed last night's operation. I am asserting something more precise and more consequential, that Beijing transferred a weapon system to Iran with the knowledge that Iran intended to use it against American naval assets, with an assessment of the operational consequences that was accurate and with the strategic calculation that those consequences served Chinese interests sufficiently to justify the transfer despite the diplomatic complications it would produce. That calculation was correct, and the strategic consequences it was designed to produce have now materialized in the operational performance of the YJ-12E last night, validated in live combat conditions against the most capable naval air defense architecture currently deployed at sea. The design parameters that Chinese engineers built into it, supersonic terminal velocity that compresses engagement timelines below American defensive system response thresholds, a sea skimming profile that degrades radar detection range to distances incompatible with reliable intercept solution generation, active radar terminal homing that is independent of electronic warfare jamming, a airframe and propulsion system that in the numbers Iran deployed produces a saturation effect against even the most capable layered defense that the mathematics of simultaneous engagement cannot overcome. Every Chinese naval planner, every Chinese military engineer, every Chinese strategic analyst who has spent 15 years developing the YJ-12E as a carrier-killing platform now has, as of this morning, live combat validation data confirming that their design achieved its intended operational effect against the specific target set it was designed for. That data will be incorporated into every Chinese military planning document that concerns American carrier operations in any theater. The implications for American carrier survivability in a Taiwan scenario, the contingency that American Pacific deterrence strategy is most critically dependent on carrier aviation to address, are not difficult to model. The National Security Council emergency session convened at the White House within 90 minutes of the first confirmed carrier sinking reports. It ran for 14 hours. What emerged was not a decision. What emerged was a statement, and the gap between the gravity of the situation that statement was responding to and the substance of the language it contained is the most precise measure available of the institutional condition Washington finds itself in this morning. Let me walk through the option set, honestly, because Washington's inability to produce a decision is not a failure of will or competence in isolation. It is the rational response of a decision-making apparatus confronting a situation in which every available option produces outcomes that are either militarily ineffective, politically unsustainable, or strategically counterproductive, and in many cases all three simultaneously. Military retaliation against Iran. The instinctive first option, the one that American strategic culture reaches for reflexively when American assets are struck, requires answering a sequencing problem that the NSE session could not resolve. Meaningful military retaliation against Iran requires targeting the YJ-12E inventory that conducted last night's strike, a mobile dispersed force distributed across 43 coastal battery sites, 4 air bases, and a surface naval component that is already repositioning to secondary anchorages. Destroying that inventory requires persistent air superiority over Iranian territory. Establishing persistent air superiority over Iranian territory requires carrier aviation. The carrier aviation that would normally execute that mission is on the seafloor of the Persian Gulf. The alternative long-range strike from Diego Garcia bomber, assets supplemented by submarine-launched cruise missiles, can cause significant damage to fixed Iranian infrastructure. It cannot destroy a mobile anti-ship missile force dispersed across dozens of positions that are changing continuously. A retaliation that kills Iranians, destroys fixed military infrastructure, and leaves the YJ-12E inventory intact is a retaliation that demonstrates American willingness to cause harm without American ability to remove the threat that produced a situation requiring retaliation. That is not a retaliatory posture. It is a demonstration of the precise limitation that Iran's operational planning was designed to reveal. Military retaliation against China, the supplier of the weapon system that conducted last night's strike, is not a serious option in any analytical framework that accounts for what direct military conflict with a nuclear-armed peer competitor means for outcomes that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. I raise it not because it is being seriously considered, but because its absence from serious consideration tells us something precise about the strategic position Washington occupies this morning. It has suffered its most significant naval defeat since the Second World War at the hands of a weapons system supplied by a power against which direct military response is not a viable option. The diplomatic track produced results in the NSC session that were by multiple accounts deeply dispiriting for the officials conducting it. Gulf Arab partners, the monarchies whose hosting of American bases provides the physical infrastructure of American regional power, responded with the measured language of governments that are no longer certain which relationship is more important to their long-term security: the American relationship they have maintained for 30 years or the accommodation with Iran that the events of the past 18 months have made increasingly urgent. Saudi Arabia called for an immediate ceasefire and offered to host negotiations. The UAE expressed condolences and called for de-escalation. Bahrain, the Fifth Fleet's home port for 3 decades, formally requested that American naval forces not seek to re-enter Bahraini waters pending a security assessment. Kuwait issued a statement calling on all parties to exercise restraint. Qatar, whose Al Udeid air base hosts the largest American military installation in the Middle East, communicated through diplomatic channels that it was reviewing the terms of its hosting agreement in light of the changed security environment. The physical infrastructure of American regional power projection is being withdrawn by the governments hosting it, not all at once, not through formal treaty abrogation, through the quiet, urgent, simultaneous reassessment of governments that have concluded on the basis of 94 minutes of operational evidence that the security calculation they have been making for 30 years requires fundamental revision. I want to say something that I think the events of the past 18 months, the Hasong 18 transfer, the YJ-12E transfer, and last night's operational outcome make impossible to honestly avoid. The world is not unipolar. It has not been unipolar in the sense that American strategic doctrine required it to be for the doctrine to function as designed, and the gap between the assumption of unipolarity that American strategy has been operating on and the multipolar reality that these events have been revealing cumulatively and now definitively is the strategic gap that last night fell through. Let me be precise about what I mean. American strategic primacy in the Persian Gulf was never purely a function of American military capability in isolation. It was a function of American military capability operating in an environment where no adversary possessed the specific weapon systems required to defeat it at scale, and where the states that might have supplied such systems to Iran had calculated that the costs of doing so outweighed the benefits. That calculation has changed. The Hwasong 1A transfer changed it in one dimension. The YJ-12E transfer changed it in another, and the operational outcome of last night, which is now demonstrated in live combat conditions, that the weapon systems transferred are operationally effective against the specific targets that American primacy in this theater depends on protecting, has changed every subsequent version of that calculation permanently. Iran did not build the YJ-12E, it received it. The transfer was a strategic decision made by a government that assessed the benefits of American naval expulsion from the Persian Gulf, reduced American ability to enforce sanctions, reduced American ability to support Israeli military operations, reduced American ability to threaten Iran with the naval presence that has been the physical instrument of American coercive diplomacy in the region for 30 years, as exceeding the diplomatic costs of supplying the weapon that achieved it. That assessment was correct, and every government that is now calculating whether the costs of challenging American military primacy in its own theater of interest are manageable is this morning updating its calculation with the most relevant data point available. It was done at a cost to the supplier that 48 hours after the event consists primarily of American diplomatic displeasure expressed through the same channels and with the same instruments that have been expressing American displeasure about Chinese behavior for a decade without producing meaningful Chinese behavioral change. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The Fifth Fleet is in the Gulf of Oman. 3 carriers are on the Persian Gulf seafloor. The Gulf monarchies are reassessing their American relationships. China has demonstrated that it can supply weapons that expel American naval forces from a critical strategic waterway and absorb the diplomatic consequences. Russia's energy revenues are increasing in real time as global oil prices respond to Hormuz closure. And Washington is producing with visible strain the language of resolve and accountability that the domestic political audience requires without the operational decisions that the strategic situation demands. The global economic consequences are immediate and severe. 17 million barrels of daily oil flow have stopped. Liquefied natural gas shipments from Qatar, the supply that heats European homes through the winter and whose disruption has been the recurring nightmare of European energy security planning, have stopped. The shipping insurance market has effectively suspended coverage for vessels attempting Hormuz transit, which means that even if the physical security environment permitted transit, the commercial economics of it do not. The Strait is closed not only by Iranian fire control, but by the rational calculation of every commercial shipping operator that the risk-adjusted cost of attempting transit exceeds any cargo value that transit could deliver. The governments most immediately affected, the Gulf monarchies whose oil revenues, economic stability, and social contract with their populations depend on Hormuz's passage, are in a position of acute strategic vulnerability that they are managing through the only instrument available to them: direct engagement with Iran. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister is in Tehran. The UAE's national security advisor is in Tehran. Qatar